Riding with the Boogeyman, narrated by Craig Roth, written by Charles H. Hinton. She was in Whitney's car, and as far as Whitney Shatter was concerned, she was as good as dead. It was routine now. She'd plead and beg for her life, just like all the others. She'd tell him that she had a small child waiting for her at home, or that her mother is on her deathbed, or she is pregnant, and so on and so forth, just like all the others. No matter the sex, race, size, or color, they seemed to never believe that none of it was really happening until he slid his hands around their throats, or beat their heads in with a tire rod, or jammed an ice pick inside one of their ear holes. Whitney Shatter had killed over 25 drifters, and as far as he knew, none of them saw it coming. And the woman, who is now staring out of Whitney's passenger side window at the full moon that whizzed in and out behind the trees, will not see it coming either. "So, where you from, Maggie?" Whitney asked. This was the formality part. In another 20 miles, he'd pull off Route 22 and drive to the spot he had ready and waiting. Until then, it was small talk time. He will offer the drink later. She would take the drink because her kind always took things. It was just the way things were. "Oh, I'm from all over," Maggie said, wiping her long black hair from her face. "You're from all over, huh? Have you ever been to San Fran?" He looked over at her. She was pretty. Not bad at all. Whitney surmised that if this was not his night out, the situation could possibly turn out differently. Yes, she was a drifter, backpack and all, but she didn't appear too far gone. She was perhaps a shower away from decency. But of course, tonight was his night, and that was that. He had worked hard to put things in order. His cell phone was at home. The game was being recorded. Well, it didn't matter who was playing. He would know all he needed to know later. He had picked a fight with his girl, Sandy, and she was told not to call him because he was not going to answer. He had told his neighbors that he was in for the night, locked down. No one knew about the Dodge Intrepid, safely stowed in the underground parking lot of the complex he owned over on Fifth Avenue. And tonight, he was wearing his blonde wig, fastened tightly to his bald head. If the law, for whatever reason, decided to come snooping, Whitney was ready for them. Whitney Shatter was going to be in the killing game forever because he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. He was nothing like the rest of those fools whom practically handed themselves over to the cops. These idiots always got too cocky and too sloppy for their own good. "Oh, yeah, I've been to San Francisco. It's nice." Maggie turned back to the window, her eyes following the huge moon. "So you're thinking of settling up there in North Dakota? Is that right?" "Yep." "Do you have family there?" He was staring at the road, watching orange and yellow leaves circle and tumble across the Dodge headlights before disappearing into the trees and green growth that surrounded them. "No, I don't have any family in North Dakota. At least I don't think so." Whitney was certain that she didn't have family in North Dakota. The same way, he was certain that her real name was not Maggie, and that she'd worked for a mapping company. He will go through her backpack later and find what he always finds: illegal drugs. Drifters were the bloodline of America's drug trade. Drug dealers used them as mules. They loaded their backpacks with drugs and used unsuspecting, law-abiding Americans to transport them from coast to coast, right up under the nose of John Q. Law. The more Whitney thought about it, the more he thought it to be ingenious. Whitney supposed that if drugs were one of his vices, that he'd most likely get in on some of the action. But this was not the case. He was not a drinker or a drug user. Whitney had his own vice, and there was no doubt in his mind that nothing compared to it. There was no place in his life for drugs, and he had no business meddling in the business of drugs. He will just bury her and the backpack in the shallow grave that was ready and waiting, and then call it a night. The thought of what he was going to do to Maggie excited him. He had already decided that he was going to use a knife this time around. It had been a while since he'd used a knife on one of his victims. He was going to slit her throat and watch as her eyes roll over white. Whitney swallowed, his throat feeling as if someone had coated it with sand. Loading up for the kill was exciting, and it always dried his throat. Well, I've heard on the radio that a bunch of neo-Nazis plan to set up shop somewhere in North Dakota. They're looking to build on an island or a lake, if I'm not mistaken. Is that true? He looked over at her, and she shrugged. He was not surprised to see her staring at the moon. Enjoy it while you can, he thought. After tonight she will never see the moon again. That is some moon, huh? It looks like something right out of a movie. He was wearing thin on small talk, and so was she. She was just yes to this or no to that. She was losing interest, and he was so sure that she was going to refuse the loaded bottled water when he offers it to her. So what? She was perhaps 120 pounds, and he was pushing 230. Push come to shove, he would backhand her a smart one across the nose and drag her from the car, kicking and screaming, before she could even think to reach for the gun inside her waistband or inside her backpack. These people always pack guns. Whitney Shatter just never gave them a chance to use them. "It is quite the moon," Maggie said. "I find it relaxing." "You find it relaxing? You are definitely a different breed, Maggie. Most people I know would associate a moon like that with the Boogeyman. Do you believe in the Boogeyman?" Maggie smiled then and said, "Of course. Don't you?" "Well, I have no choice but to believe in the Boogeyman, Maggie, because I am the Boogeyman." Maggie turned to him and smiled. Whitney smiled. It was the smile that he had practiced over and over in the mirror. It was a trusting smile, and it worked on his family, it worked on his friends, it worked on his co-workers, and it never failed to work on his victims. "That's right. I am the Boogeyman. Now hear me roar." Whitney howled like a wolf and then bellowed laughter. Maggie clasped a small hand across her mouth, stifling her laughter. There, he was now back on solid ground. The window was open, and he had to take it before it closed. "Geez, I'm about as dry as a desert. I'm dying for some water. Mind if I pull over and grab a bottle from the cooler? It's in the trunk." "Well, of course I don't mind," Maggie said. "I'll grab you one. I have plenty. They are strawberry-flavored. They're really tasty." "Oh, okay. Thank you. You are, without a doubt, a virtuous Boogeyman." "Well, you have to start somewhere." Whitney pulled the car to the shoulder of the road. "It won't take but a second." He climbed out of the car, the clothes on his 6-foot frame flapping like sails in the wind. You have to start somewhere. This was true. The Boogeyman inside of Whitney started, as far as he could remember, 30 years ago. Whitney Stanley Shatter was just a kid bound for the 5th grade at the end of summer, on the day he became the Boogeyman. He was making his way across Haley's Park, tossing and batting a tennis ball with his Louisville slugger. One minute he was Babe Ruth, the next Jackie Robinson. Reggie Jackson was at the plate when Whitney heard the firecrackers. He looked over and saw 2 boys standing in the playground that was about 50 feet from where he stood. Their shadows stretched out behind him like black, elongated creatures. Whitney didn't know them, but he knew who they were. It was Archie Arnwine and Bill or Bobby Fancelli. He wasn't sure if the kid with the long blonde hair, his first name was Bill or Bobby, but he knew Archie, with his freckled face and flaming red hair, all too well. Archie had terrorized his school until he was finally pushed on to junior high. Bill, or Bobby, went to a different school, but had shown up at Whitney School on several occasions to assist Archie in administrating some of his devious deeds. If Archie wasn't beating up some kid for holding back on his lunch money, he was pulverizing some chump for refusing to let him copy his homework. Whitney stood in the distance, watching the boys light the firecrackers, blowing the crap out of ant holes, tin cans, old sneakers, cigarette wraps, and anything and everything they could get their hands on. He wanted so badly to join in on the fun, but was wise enough to know that if he'd step 1 foot over there, that he would end up being the fun. They'd most likely pin him down and shove one of those loud babies right down his pants. "Well, my daddy says that if you light a match to a fart, blue flames will shoot out of your butt," Bill or Bobby said. "You want to try it?" The wind carried this voice to Whitney on an invisible flying carpet. "Nuts to that," Archie quipped. "I'm just going to have to take your old man's word for it." "Are you sure?" "You're dog right, I'm sure." "Well, suit yourself. See you around." Bill, or Bobby, tossed his leg over his bike and then rode off with the orange sun at his back. Archie stuffed a handful of firecrackers inside the right front pocket of his faded jeans and then walked in Whitney's direction, shading his eyes from the intense sunlight that was slowly turning the horizon purple and magenta. Whitney looked to his left, then to his right. There was no one. He looked behind him. Zilch. Archie, his mind elsewhere, walked past Whitney without a glance. Whitney Shatter, who had never wet the bed, tore the wings off of bugs, played with dead and bloated things in the streets, or killed small animals, turned and batted a home run against Archie's skull. Whitney took off running just before Archie Arnwine's body hit the grass with a heavy thump. He stowed the bat under his parents' porch until the cops and media frenzy blew over. When the heat simmered and the cops could not figure out who on God's earth could have done such a thing, Whitney retrieved the bat and cleaned it of blood, hair, scalp, and what could only have been small skull fragments. He loved his Louisville Slugger, and he loved what it had done. It felt good. It was powerful. He had, for the first time, tasted the power over life or death. And, at the age of 10, he knew right then and there that he was never going to give it up. He knew right then and there, if he played his cards right, he could last a long time in the killing business. All he had to do was be smart and not get greedy. Kill here, kill there, and always stay under the radar. In fact, it wasn't until he was 16 until he killed again. Yes, he had thought about it many times, but the opportunity never fell on his lap like it had with Archie. There was a lot of heat over Archie's death, and Whitney knew that he had to be careful. The man Whitney shot with his deer rifle when he was 16 was pulled over to the side of a dirt road staring under the hood of his pickup. Whitney had spied him a quarter mile from the tangle of brown brush and trees that surrounded him. He looked around and saw no one. Whitney placed the man in his crosshairs and followed him. He watched him lean against his pickup, cross his arms, draw in a deep breath. Whitney placed the crosshairs on the man's forehead and then pulled the trigger. The man's head exploded into a red spray of blood and brains. Whitney took off running across Eller Wather's land. Eller was old, rich, widowed, and could give a fiddler's fart who hunted on his land. His only rules were, do not kill anything you're not going to eat, and do not kill each other. Whitney broke both of the rules. When he got home, his old man, the late and great Frank Shatter, who's now buried next to his wife, The late and great Amy Shatter asked him how it went. Whitney only shrugged, but inside he was floating on cloud 9 and 10. Once again he had the power over life or death, and brother did it feel ever so good. According to the newspaper, the man whose head had been blown clear from his body was Dave Dotter, a father of 2. His death was ruled an unfortunate hunting accident. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and was shot by a careless hunter. However, investigators were still looking into the incident. Whitney had planned to keep the newspaper clipping, but thought better of it. He was going to have a long go at killing, and if things so happened to get a bit hairy, the last thing he needed was a paper trail. Whitney was 18 and on his way to college when he picked up his first drifter, some dude in his 20s on the way to California. Whitney knew that he was going to kill him the moment he climbed inside his car. It was just a matter of the right time and the right place. Well, the right time came at 12 midnight. The right place was a rest stop outside of Denver. Whitney strangled the hitchhiker from behind with a necktie the moment he entered the restroom. The drifter put up a fight, but in the end he laid sprawled out on the bathroom floor with his jeans darkened with urine, eyes bulging from their sockets and his mouth a yarning O. Whitney tossed the drifter's belongings from the car, then took off down the highway, riding high from the kill. By the time he made it out of the state of Colorado, he'd lost count of all the drifters he had passed by. One thing was clear, though. There were plenty of them for the pickings. So Whitney Shatter began to pick them one by one. He had killed over 25 of these wandering souls by the time he was 48, and now the time had come for Maggie to meet the thing inside him that could only be the Boogeyman. The cooler inside of Whitney's trunk contained 2 strawberry-flavored bottled waters. The water on his right was laced with sleeping pills that he had dissolved and injected with a syringe. Never leaving anything for chance, Whitney had tested his evil remedy on himself, starting with the smallest dose, of course, until he had perfected it. Even though his victims came in different shapes and sizes, his drug always worked. Within 10 minutes of its ingestion, they started to feel drowsy, dizzy, and to speak incoherently. But most importantly, they were defenseless. Whitney grabbed the waters and climbed back inside the car. "Here you go." He popped the safety seal and removed the cap, giving Maggie zero chance to save the water for later. She reached and grabbed it gently from his hand. "Thanks." She raised the water to her lips and drank heartily. Whitney opened his bottle and raised it high. "Cheers," he said. They both drank in silence. The trail, leading miles into dense forestry, had been made by vehicles that were long gone. The Dodge bumped and jittered and swayed side to side on 2 grooves that were overgrowing with rocks, weeds, and leaves. Ahead was the old Ford pickup, rusted red and naked. The Ford marked the end of the road, if you want to call what Whitney was putzing on a road. The shallow grave he had dug the day before was about 100 yards beyond the truck, far enough within the trees and shrubbery to do his deed and keep his deed a secret. Whitney parked in front of the pickup and killed his headlights. He had brought along a flashlight, but found that it was not necessary. The swollen moon proved to be all the guiding light he would need. Whitney climbed out of the car and walked over to the passenger side. He opened the door and pulled Maggie out by her arm. She was foggy and distant. Her speech was a jumble of madness, murmurs of the Boogeyman, Bad Wolf, the moon. Whitney led her easily past the truck and deeper into the woods, his hand fastened around her wrist, her backpack fastened over his shoulder. He carried a hunting knife in his right hand. Maggie was none the wiser. "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie," Whitney said, his breath pluming from his mouth in white streams. "What am I to do with you?" They were now standing 5 feet from the shallow grave. Trees swayed above, and the ones that could afford it trickled down orange and yellow leaves. The mist that started out thin and uneventful was now thickening around their legs. It seemed as if it was trying to engulf them, eat them. "You know, Maggie, it's getting late, so I think I'm just going to cut off your ears, your nose, and then slit your throat. How does that sound?" He raised the hunting knife to Maggie's face, its blade a dull twinkle beneath the moonlight. Now comes the begging and pleading, he thought. This was the part that tickled him. He'd heard it all and seen it all. But this time, there was no begging or pleading. There was only agonizing screams. Maggie yanked her wrist from his hand and then grabbed his wrist. There was a loud snap as the bones inside Whitney's forearm exploded out of his skin in yellow-white shards. Whitney screamed and dropped the knife. Maggie began to change. Black hairs poured from her face, her hands, and beneath her shirt and jeans. Her eyes swelled and grew huge and yellow. Her ears pinned back into furry triangles. Her bones crackled, crunched, and contorted as she began to grow. Her nose and mouth stretched out into a long snout that bore 8-inch canines. Her clothes, unable to contain her huge, massive 7-foot bulk, ripped from her body. The werewolf looked down at Whitney, its yellow eyes filled with rage and murder. It smelled like an unkempt zoo. Whitney's shatter screamed. The beast snarled and chomped down on his face. Its top teeth dug into Whitney's cheekbones, and its bottom clamped under his chin. It bit down as Whitney's face exploded into a jumble of red meat, bone, gristle, and shattered teeth. He fell on his back, gurgling bloody, tormented screams from a hole that was once a human mouth. The werewolf raised its head and howled at the moon. Its hot breath jetted out like a steam engine. The creature turned to Whitney and tore into his stomach with huge teeth, unzipping his guts. And steam rose from the open cavity in a swirling stench. All Whitney could do was watch and try to scream without a mouth. The werewolf slapped a heavy paw with 8-inch claws across the top of Whitney's head. His blonde wig vanished into white skull. Blood instantly filled the meaty vacancy. It flowed down and inside his ears in wet, sticky streams, appearing as black as oil in the moonlight. The monster howled again before tearing into Whitney's throat, ripping out cords and blood vessels. Whitney's eyes swarmed in circles. The beast pressed its snout against what was left of his face, growling and slobbering, its long tongue lopped to one side. The man, who was going to kill forever, was now looking into the yellow, raged, hateful eyes of death. Whitney Stanley Shatter died, staring into the eyes of the Boogeyman. Riding with the Boogeyman, narrated by Craig Roth, written by Charles H. Hinton.